Blinded by swirling snow and pinned down by ferocious winds, the elderly farmer had only one chance to keep breathing, push forward, or let the frozen night consume him. Before we get into this story, let us know where you're watching from and subscribe for more tales like this one. We upload every day at the same time. He could hardly see more than a few feet ahead, each step a gamble against unseen obstacles beneath the shifting drifts. Daniel Hayes, 72 years old, had faced his share of fierce Wyoming storms, but tonight's gale was a thing of nightmares. The howling wind whipped frost into his eyes and stung his exposed cheeks. His breath came in ragged gasps as he trudged onward, determined to reach the safety of his ranch house, still miles away across the frozen plains. In his many years of living off the land, he'd survived droughts, harsh winters, and financial ruin, but never had he felt the sharp edge of mortality so keenly. The darkness all around felt suffocating, as if the night itself conspired to erase him from existence. Yet he forced himself to move, to keep his legs pumping, even as his knees threatened to buckle with each ragged step. When the wheels of his old pickup gave out miles from home, he'd stood in silent shock, staring at a dead engine he had no hope of reviving in the midst of a whiteout. The cold bit into his fingers as he struggled with the hood, cursing his luck while the wind tried to tear the door off its hinges. Finally, he'd abandoned the truck and begun the long, treacherous journey on foot. Every 100 yards, the swirling vortex of ice seemed to redouble in fury, as though nature itself roared at him to turn back. But turning back made no sense. Behind him was nothing but endless fields of white. He had to go forward, no matter the cost. In the relentless swirl of ice and darkness, Daniel's mind played cruel tricks on him. Shadows danced at the edges of his vision, forming shapes that seemed to dart in and out of the storm. He'd stop and squint, trying to distinguish friend from foe, only to see nothing but the swirling haze. His heart hammered in his chest every time a gust brought a deep, echoing wail. He told himself it was just the wind, but a deeper fear whispered it could be wolves. He shook off the thought. As if on cue, a sharp gust cut through his coat, reminding him he had bigger worries: frostbite, hypothermia, and simply losing his way in this suffocating white. He had a ranch to get back to, livestock to look after, and an old dog waiting by the fire. He refused to lie down and die here. If this storm wanted him, it would have to work harder. Still, each step was an act of will. His breath frosted in the air, and the dull ache in his fingers told him he was losing feeling in them. He fumbled with the collar of his coat, trying to shield his face. The storm slapped him again, nearly knocking him to his knees. A wave of dizziness overcame him, and he stumbled, catching himself just before hitting the snow. The reek of fear rose in his throat. If he fell and stayed down, it would be the end. He had to keep moving, keep searching for any sign of the ranch's perimeter fence or the slight glow of the porch light he'd left on. He mumbled encouragement to himself, half delirious, clinging to the memory of his cozy living room. The memory of his wife, gone these past 10 years, flickered through his mind. He refused to be beaten by some storm, no matter how fierce. Yet, even as he rallied his spirit, another force battered him: exhaustion. His legs felt like dead weights. His eyes blinked slower and slower, the cold seeping through every layer he wore. The swirling flakes were mesmerizing, and he had to fight the urge to lie down in the snow, to close his eyes just for a moment. He pressed on, scolding himself for the thought. Over the screaming wind, he thought he caught a new sound, a rhythmic thudding, as if large hooves were striking the ground in the near distance. He paused, heart pounding, and strained his ears. At first, he wondered if it was his own heartbeat, or maybe the frantic pulse in his ears. But there it was again. Hoofbeats. Could one of his horses have broken free? The very idea made his heart leap with concern. Though he only kept a couple of aging mares in the stable these days, his finances had forced him to sell most of his livestock over the years. But maybe an animal had wandered out. He started to call out, but the wind snatched his voice away. He shuffled forward, praying he was moving in the right direction. If there was a horse, perhaps it could guide him, or at least provide some warmth. Suddenly, a dark shape materialized in the blur ahead, silhouetted by the faint reflection of moonlight on snow. Daniel's pulse quickened. The form looked larger than a typical mare. The figure stamped the ground once, a majestic silhouette in the swirling chaos. Daniel called out, fighting the wind, "Here, boy! Hey!" The shape whinnied softly. Its breath formed plumes of steam in the cold air. Gathering his courage, Daniel moved closer until he could see it more clearly. A Mustang stallion, its coat dusted with icy crystals, eyes bright with a wild, untamed intelligence. But what on earth was a lone Mustang doing here, in the middle of this storm? Wild horses roamed distant ranges, rarely venturing near inhabited ranches. It stood still, watching him with ears pricked, as though it were assessing. his condition deciding if he posed a threat or needed help. Daniel extended a trembling hand, not quite sure why this beast didn't bolt. It was obviously not corralled, and its power was undeniable. Yet something about it radiated calm amidst the furious blizzard. The stallion gave a soft snort, stepping closer until Daniel could almost feel the heat of its breath on his cold, aching skin. He spoke in a hushed tone, though the wind made his words meaningless. "You're a sight for sore eyes," he managed, trying to quell the shakes in his voice. To his surprise, the stallion did not back away. Instead, it allowed him to reach out, gently touching its muzzle. For a moment, Daniel nearly forgot the storm that howled around them. He was transfixed by this improbable meeting. Then reality crashed back in. A particularly vicious gust slammed into his back, nearly toppling him forward. The Mustang tossed its head as if to warn him, "Keep moving or freeze." Daniel was at a crossroads. He could try to trek forward on foot alone, but his body was failing him. If the horse was willing, perhaps he could lead him out of this place. But how to mount a wild Mustang? One jolt of those powerful hindquarters could send Daniel sprawling. Yet, as if reading his desperate thoughts, the stallion took a step closer, positioning its flank near him. Even in the limited visibility, Daniel could see the creature's muscles quivering from exertion, the cold, leeching energy from both of them. He reached for the horse's mane, a motion so instinctive it bypassed fear. The stallion didn't rear or spook. Instead, it huffed, standing still as Daniel, shivering and short of breath, attempted to haul himself up. Twice he slipped, pain sparking in his shoulders. On the third try, he managed to get a leg over the horse's back. Perched precariously on the stallion, Daniel clutched fistfuls of the coarse mane, his heart hammering with the realization that he was riding a wild beast with no saddle or bridle. The Mustang began to move at a steady walk, each step surprisingly sure-footed despite the drifts of snow. Daniel buried his face in the horse's mane, trying to shield himself from the wind. He could only trust the animal to somehow take him to safety. Time lost meaning in that swirling void of ice. The storm's roar seemed unending. The horse navigated dips and rises, forging a path in a direction Daniel could not guess. Occasionally, Daniel's vision swam with exhaustion, and the only thing keeping him from sliding off was the fierce grip of his hands on the horse's mane. Fear ebbed and flowed. Fear of the unknown. Fear that this Mustang might buck him off at the slightest provocation. Fear of freezing to death mere miles from home. It felt like hours passed, though it might have been minutes. The Mustang pressed on, forging a path through the deepest snowdrifts. Daniel marveled at the creature's stamina. He'd raised horses before, many years ago. But something about this stallion's fierce independence struck him as more vital, more determined than any he'd encountered. Often, wild Mustangs avoided humans, but this one was helping him. Why? He felt a pang of hope deep within his chest. The Mustang's warmth under his half-numb legs reminded him that he wasn't alone in this fight for survival. Perhaps neither of them wanted to face the storm without an ally. A sudden swirl of snow revealed a break in the unending white, a cluster of boulders rising from the plains like silent sentinels. The stallion slowed, breathing heavily, as it approached the natural barrier against the wind. Here, the wind's fury was partially blocked, creating a small pocket of relative calm. Daniel slid off, nearly collapsing as his legs gave way. He leaned against the cold stone, chest heaving. The Mustang stood close, sides slick with melting snow. Daniel's face stung, his fingers screamed with cold, but at least he was out of the worst of the gale for the moment. He tried to speak, to thank the horse, though it was absurd. The words caught in his throat, coming out as a cracked whisper. The horse nickered softly in response, or perhaps in acknowledgement, before it dropped its head to paw at the ground, searching for any hidden grass beneath the snow. For a few precious minutes, Daniel let the adrenaline subside, though his body trembled from cold and fatigue. He needed to keep moving if he was going to survive. Stopping too long could be a death sentence in these conditions, but moving forward without a plan felt equally dangerous. His mind raced, but the only coherent thought that emerged was that this stallion might be his best and only chance. After a short rest, he summoned his last reserves of strength, carefully hauling himself back onto the horse's back. The Mustang didn't protest, merely snorted and resumed its determined forward march. Everything was white and grey as far as Daniel could see. The horizon vanished in the storm. Without the horse, he would be hopelessly lost. He wondered if the Mustang had some deeper sense of direction, perhaps some instinct guiding it through the turmoil. He didn't have the luxury of second-guessing. He clung to the Mustang's mane and pressed his body against its neck to share warmth. Snow collected on his hat, clung to his eyebrows, and coated the horse's flanks. Each time the Mustang hesitated, Daniel's heart pounded, afraid that a hidden chasm or an icy ravine might spell doom. Yet each time, the stallion found safe footing and pressed on. Gradually, the wind eased, the snow lessened, and Daniel dared to peer around for a landmark. Through the thinning veil, a small wooden fence post came into view, half buried under, adrift. Relief flooded him. This was part of his property boundary, if he recalled correctly. He prayed the Mustang would follow the fence line toward the ranch house. But to his surprise, the stallion veered off the path, angling toward a distant stand of trees. Daniel's confusion sparked. Why head that way? He tried to tug the mane, as if to guide the horse, but it only snorted and pressed on, ignoring his feeble attempts. Fear stirred again. Could the horse be leading him astray? Maybe the Mustang just knew some place of refuge he didn't. He had no choice but to trust it, clinging desperately with his arms wrapped around the creature's neck. Soon, the stand of trees loomed larger, their branches laden with snow. Daniel realized it was a small grove near a frozen creek he sometimes used for irrigation. The horse guided him through the tree line, where the wind was calmer and the snow was less treacherous. He began to see footprints, possibly deer or other wildlife, crisscrossing the area. The relative shelter gave Daniel a chance to catch his breath, though his body was still dangerously cold. Ice coated his beard, making it stiff, and he felt the sting of frost forming in his eyebrows. He dared not remove his gloves to wipe at it. Through chattering teeth, he muttered a half prayer, half thank you to the stallion. The animal blinked at him, almost as though it understood. Just as Daniel felt a measure of relief, a distant howl cut through the trees. His stomach tightened at once. Wolves. They roamed the region, especially in winter, scavenging for any food they could find. A sense of dread gnawed at him. With the storm abating, predators might be on the move, driven by hunger. The Mustang's ears pricked forward, and it let out a nervous snort. The horse shifted its weight, stepping anxiously through the snow. Another howl echoed, closer this time. Daniel cursed under his breath. Wolves were the last thing he needed. He had no real weapon to speak of. A small pocket knife, some flares in his truck, long forgotten now. He scanned the surroundings for any sign of movement among the trunks and snowdrifts. The stand of trees might provide some cover, but if wolves smelled them, they would close in. His heart thudded in his chest. Should he try to outrun them on horseback? The Mustang, exhausted as it was, might still outpace a wolf pack, but the terrain was unfamiliar, and deep snow could slow them both. Moreover, the horse was wild. Its patience with him might evaporate if panic set in. The next howl sounded even nearer, and his breath caught. He looked down at the Mustang's flank, noticing a faint scar near its shoulder, a small curved mark that stood out against the dark coat. Something about that scar jolted his memory, but he couldn't focus on it now. Survival took precedence. He tapped the horse's side lightly, not sure how else to communicate his urgency. The stallion raised its head and started forward at a brisk walk. Daniel's heart hammered. He peered over his shoulder constantly, expecting to see lean, predatory shapes weaving through the shadows. The swirling wind made it hard to pinpoint anything by sound. Soon, they emerged from the grove on the other side, facing the open plains again. The ranch house was somewhere to the southwest, if his bearings were correct. The Mustang picked up speed, forging into the deeper snow. Daniel tightened his grip, ignoring the pain in his thighs. Each gust of wind threatened to topple him off. but he refused to let go. They pushed on for what felt like hours, the landscape an endless repetition of white. Daniel started to think maybe the wolves had chosen easier prey elsewhere. He hoped so. The Mustang's sides heaved with exertion. Daniel's own lungs burned. Just when he dared to think they had escaped the predators, a shape moved in his peripheral vision. Heart lurching, he turned to see a loping grey figure cresting a snowdrift. Then another emerged, and another. Wolves, 3 of them, lean with hunger. Their eyes glowed with a fierce intelligence, and their breath frosted in the air. The Mustang, sensing the threat, let out a sharp neigh and broke into a run. Daniel clung on for dear life as they galloped across the snow, hooves striking through crusty drifts and sending powder flying in every direction. The wolves gave chase, their movements eerily graceful. Daniel's heart pounded with primal fear. He'd heard stories of packs bringing down horses, especially in winter when hunger sharpened their aggression. He prayed the Mustang's stamina could hold out just a little longer. The swirling wind stung his eyes, but he forced himself to look ahead, scanning for any sign of the ranch or even a small barn he might have left standing. His old property was vast, and not all of it was fenced. As they charged through the storm, the wolves moved in formation, flanking the Mustang on either side. The stallion veered sharply, nearly unseating Daniel, and one wolf closed in dangerously. Daniel heard the snap of jaws behind him. Terror spurred him to action. He ripped off his glove with his teeth, fumbling for the small pocket knife he kept in his coat. It was a pathetic weapon, but better than nothing. His fingers, numb from the cold, struggled to grip it. The Mustang tossed its head, maneuvering through the drifts, fighting to keep distance from the predators. One wolf surged closer, and Daniel twisted in the saddleless seat, slashing blindly. He felt the blade connect with fur, a brief resistance, and a yelp. The wolf fell back, but its companions pressed on, undeterred. The stallion's breathing was ragged, each exhalation filled with steam. Daniel urged it on, though he had no real control. He was a passenger to the horse's instincts, praying those instincts would guide them to safety. They barreled over a small rise, hooves skidding on a patch of ice. For a moment, Daniel feared they would go down, but the stallion recovered, muscles quivering with the effort to stay upright. The wolves circled behind them, one leaping to snap at the Mustang's rear legs. The horse lashed out with a powerful kick, connecting with the wolf's ribs. Daniel heard a crack, and the wolf tumbled away, whimpering. That left 2 still in pursuit, and they seemed more cautious now, though no less determined. They hung back, waiting for an opening. Daniel's face burned from the wind, but he focused on survival. Everything else, his age, his regrets, his past, faded in the face of this immediate fight for life. The Mustang swerved suddenly, and Daniel realized it was heading toward a cluster of outbuildings on the far side of the ranch property. He recognized the rusted roof of an old barn he'd once used for storing hay bales. A flicker of hope sparked in him. If he could get inside that barn, maybe he could barricade the entrance. He had no illusions about fending off a determined wolf pack, but at least it would be better than open ground. The wolves, sensing their quarry was aiming for some form of sanctuary, picked up speed. Daniel heard their snarls behind him, and the Mustang's gait became erratic, exhaustion pulling at the horse's legs. Snow and ice flew around them as the Mustang finally reached the barn's broken door. Daniel nearly fell off when the horse wheeled around, kicking at one of the wolves that lunged in. Clutching the horse's mane with one hand and his knife in the other, he thrust downward at the wolf's face. The blade caught air as the animal dodged, teeth snapping at the Mustang's flank. The horse lashed out with a fierce squeal, forcing the wolf back. Daniel saw an opening to slip inside the barn, and with a ragged breath, he launched himself off the horse's back, nearly face-planting into the snow. One of the wolves scrambled after him, but the Mustang stomped the ground, aggressively, forcing the predator to rethink. Daniel scrambled, half crawling, to get inside the barn, yelling for the stallion to follow him. The Mustang danced nervously, eyes wide, before it barreled through the door, nearly trampling Daniel in the process. The structure groaned as the horse forced its way inside. With shaking hands, Daniel slammed the door shut, kicking a fallen beam into place to jam it closed. Outside, frustrated snarls echoed across the snowy yard. But for the moment, the wolves were kept at bay. Panting heavily, Daniel leaned against the door, his heart feeling as though it would burst from his chest. The Mustang stood in the darkness of the barn, sides heaving, steam rising from its coat in the frigid air. For a moment, neither man nor beast moved. They shared a heartbeat of mutual understanding. They had fought for their lives together. Darkness enveloped them, but Daniel felt relief flooding his limbs. He reached out, placing a trembling hand on the Mustang's neck. The horse flinched, but then allowed the touch. It was still wild, still on edge, but a fragile trust had been built between them in that storm-lashed chase. Outside, the wolves circled, growling and scratching, but the barn walls held. Daniel knew they couldn't stay here forever, but for now, they had shelter. He sank to the floor, every muscle in his body screaming, the cold drilling into his bones. Yet he was alive, and so was the horse. As the wind bellowed outside, Daniel realized that this was only the beginning of a much longer battle for survival. At least he had a roof over his head for the moment, and an unlikely ally in a lone Mustang that had chosen not to abandon him. Time slipped by in the darkness. Daniel dared not open the doors to let in even a hint of the blizzard. He tried to catch his breath, focusing on staying awake. Sleep now could be deadly. Frostbite threatened his toes and fingers, and the Mustang needed rest. He rose on unsteady legs, searching through the barn for anything useful. His flashlight had been lost somewhere in the storm, but a bit of moonlight filtered in through gaps in the walls. He found an old blanket, stiff with age, which he draped over himself, though it offered little warmth. He discovered a few mouldy bales of hay in the corner, food of sorts for the horse if it came to that. The horse rummaged for what it could, snorting when it found bits of dried grass. He let it eat, hoping it would restore some of its strength. Outside, the wolves kept up their vigil. Daniel heard occasional snarls, the crunch of paws in the snow. He imagined them circling, waiting for him to slip up, or for the horse to step out in panic. His mind churned for a plan. At dawn, if the storm eased, maybe he could risk a dash to the main house. But that was still a ways off. They might freeze before then, or the wolves might find a way in. Exhaustion weighed heavily on him. His vision blurred, and he felt his head nodding. He fought against it, slapping his cheeks, trying to stay conscious. Pain flared in his side from where he'd landed on the ground, and the sting reminded him he was still alive. He crawled toward the horse, placing a hand on its flank. The stallion's muscles twitched beneath his touch, but it didn't move away. Warm breath puffed from its nostrils, giving Daniel a small measure of comfort in this bleak place. In the flickering half-light, he studied that scar again. A faint crescent shape on the horse's shoulder, a memory from years past tugged at the back of his mind. He'd found a foal caught in a barbed wire fence near the edge of his property. This was back when he was younger, more energetic, with the resources to keep more horses. He'd cut the wire free and treated the wound. Then the foal had run off, too wild to keep penned. Could this be that same horse, returned as a full-grown stallion? The mere thought both astonished and humbled him. He couldn't be certain, but his gut told him it was possible. Night wore on in the cold confines of the barn. Daniel nodded, off, only to jolt awake at every scratch and growl from outside. The Mustang dozed fitfully, ears flicking at every noise. The adrenaline spike from their earlier chase wore thin, replaced by throbbing limbs and the ache of his old bones. Daniel kept the pocket knife gripped in his hand, though he knew it was pitiful protection against a pack of wolves if they somehow forced their way in. He considered the possibility of lighting a fire, but the barn was too full of old, dry timbers. One spark could turn the whole place into a blazing death trap. Yet the biting cold made fire just as tempting. He stayed his hand, deciding the risk was too great. Eventually, the howling wind outside began to subside, though the temperature still felt lethal. Daniel estimated it was well past midnight. If morning came and the skies cleared, he might stand a chance of reaching the ranch house. His mind drifted to the handful of cattle that might still be out in the fields. They could be frozen stiff by now. Guilt gnawed at him. He was their caretaker, and here he was, unable to do anything. He swallowed those thoughts. Survival came first. He tried to coax his limbs into some form of warmth, rubbing his hands together and breathing onto them. By the faint glow seeping in through the cracks, Daniel guessed that dawn was near. He pressed an ear to the barn door, listening. Silence, except for the faint whisper of wind across the plains. No growls, no snarls. Maybe the wolves had moved on to find easier prey. Carefully, he eased the barn door open just a crack, letting in a swirl of icy air. Outside, a half-moon hung low, in the sky, its pale light illuminating a landscape of sparkling snowdrifts. Tracks circled the barn, evidence the wolves had indeed prowled around. But he saw no movement now. The storm had passed, leaving behind a deathly calm. He sensed the temperature had dropped even further, a bitter cold that seemed to freeze his breath in mid-air. But at least the blizzard had ceased its roaring. He turned to the Mustang, meeting its bright, watchful eyes. He whispered, "Time to go, boy." The horse flicked its ears, as if considering the matter. Summoning every ounce of strength left in his aching body, Daniel pushed the door open enough for them to slip out. The snow glistened in the moonlight, and his boots crunched loudly as he stepped into the night. The Mustang followed, moving gingerly after so many harrowing hours. Daniel scanned the horizon, searching for the faint glow of his ranch house. At first, there was nothing but the quiet sparkle of moonlit snow. Then, off in the distance, a soft light beckoned, flickering slightly, like a candle in a sea of white. Home. Relief flooded him, almost bringing tears to his eyes. The distance was still considerable, and the temperature remained deadly. But now, he had a direction, and he had a companion. He managed to climb onto the Mustang's back again, wincing with each movement. The stallion huffed, but didn't buck him off. It stepped forward, forging a path across the frozen expanse. Each hoofstep felt like a small victory, each breath a testament to their combined will to survive. The moon watched them, silent and cold, as they inched closer to the lone light that promised warmth and safety. He dared a look back at the barn, half expecting the wolves to emerge, but the place was still and dark. Perhaps the predators had decided to leave them be. He silently thanked whatever higher power might be watching over them. Then he fixed his gaze on the distant glow, focusing on that small beacon of hope in a landscape that had tried its best to claim him. The hush of pre-dawn settled around them, broken only by the soft crunch of snow under hooves and the hiss of Daniel's labored breathing. Above, the clouds parted, revealing a tapestry of stars. For a fleeting moment, Daniel felt an overwhelming gratitude just to be alive, to witness the timeless beauty of the winter sky. With the wolves seemingly gone and the storm past, another challenge loomed. The possibility of further frostbite, or simply not having the strength to finish the journey. Daniel forced himself to stay alert, to focus on the moment. The Mustang pressed on, unwavering. Together, they had survived the initial assault of the storm and the snap of hungry jaws. Now, they needed to conquer the final stretch. The ranch, with its peeling paint and old-fashioned porch, waited for them like a lighthouse in a storm-tossed sea. If they could make it there, maybe there was still a chance for both man and horse to rest, to heal. The last half-mile was the hardest. Daniel's vision blurred from fatigue. The Mustang stumbled once or twice, nearly toppling them both into the snow. Each time, Daniel whispered words of encouragement he wasn't sure the horse could understand. Yet the stallion pressed on. Finally, the shape of his house came into full view. The sloping roofline, the porch rail, the single lantern left hanging by the front door. A sob caught in Daniel's throat. He never thought he'd be so grateful for that neglected home. He eased himself off the horse's back, nearly falling as his stiff legs gave way. The Mustang stood by, nostrils flaring, as if refusing to let him collapse now. Daniel stumbled up the porch steps, flinging open the door to a rush of warm air from inside. He turned back, beckoning the horse to follow, but it stood at the bottom of the steps, uncertain. He couldn't blame it. This was a wild creature, after all. It had brought him home, saved his life, and now it seemed unsure if it belonged here. Daniel blinked back tears, croaking a hoarse invitation. "Come on in if you want. There's warmth." The horse pawed the snow, ears flicking back and forth. Then, with a sudden swirl of its tail, it trotted around to the side of the house, out of sight. Daniel's heart panged, but he was too exhausted to chase after it. He staggered inside, shutting the door behind him, leaning against it as warmth seeped into his frozen limbs. He sank to the floor, gasping from the temperature change and relief that threatened to overwhelm him. His dog, an old collie named Rusty, bounded over, whining and licking his face. Daniel managed a chuckle, pressing his face into the dog's fur. He had no idea how long he lay there, half conscious, letting his body thaw. Eventually he mustered the energy to move, shrugging off his ice-caked coat. His fingers tingled painfully as sensation returned. He went to the kitchen, turned on the faucet, and let out a shaky breath when water flowed. He drank, nearly choking in his haste. Then he lit the old wood stove, coaxing flames to life. The sight of fire was mesmerizing, a contrast to the deadly cold outside. As he warmed up, his mind drifted to the Mustang. Had it simply vanished, returning to its wild domain now that its strange mission was complete? He felt an odd mixture of sadness and awe. Who would believe that a lone wild horse had guided him through a lethal storm and helped him fend off wolves? The scar on the stallion's shoulder haunted him. Could it really be the same horse he'd freed so many years ago? He wanted to check outside, but exhaustion pulled at him, and he knew he needed to recover. Tomorrow, if it was still there, maybe he could coax it into the old stable, or at least offer it some food. For now, he was grateful just to be alive. Eventually, his eyes slid shut, and he fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, collapsed on the worn couch near the stove. The last thing he remembered was Rusty settling at his feet, and the roar of the wind outside fading into a distant lullaby. He didn't know how long he slept. Morning light streamed in through the windows when he stirred, bringing with it fresh aches and pains. Every muscle protested as he dragged himself upright, but he was alive, and the house was mercifully warm. He tottered to the window, peering out onto the snow-blanketed yard. The brilliance of the day made him squint. The storm had swept the sky clean, leaving a piercing blue dome overhead. Scanning the yard, he saw no immediate sign of the Mustang. He felt a pang of disappointment, though a part of him hoped the horse had simply wandered around back. After, pulling on slightly drier clothes and boots, he gingerly stepped outside. The cold was still sharp, but nowhere near as brutal as during the storm. He walked around the side of the house, each step crunching through crusted snow. To his surprise, he found a set of hoofprints leading toward the small barn near the western fence line. Following them, he reached the barn door, which was ajar. Stepping inside, he was greeted by the sight of the Mustang, quietly nudging the remnants of a bale of hay. The horse lifted its head, ears forward, but did not bolt. Daniel's heart swelled with gratitude. He spoke softly. "Good morning, fella. You hungry?" He approached with caution, though the horse seemed calm, if wary. He noted the dried streaks of sweat and the fresh scratches on the stallion's flank, evidence of their battle with the wolves. Daniel rummaged in a corner where he'd stored some horse feed, grateful he had a bit left. He poured a small mound into a bucket, offering it slowly. The Mustang eyed it, then stepped forward, tentatively sniffing before it began to eat. Daniel reached out, lightly running his fingers over that old scar. It felt surreal to confirm what his heart had told him. This was indeed the horse he'd once freed from a cruel wire trap. Fate had reunited them in the midst of the deadliest storm of his life. The horse finished its meal and turned to Daniel, blowing soft breath into the cold air. For a moment, they stood there, man and horse, two survivors who had found each other again against all odds. Daniel shook his head in wonder. He realized that the Mustang's presence was more than just luck. It was almost as if this creature had been watching over him, waiting for the moment he needed help the most. The notion was as comforting as it was astonishing. He gently patted the stallion's side, and the horse didn't flinch away. Although it still carried the wild glint in its eye, it seemed content to share a space with the old farmer for now. A sudden flash of memory overcame Daniel. The day he found the foal, tangled and bleeding, left to die in the barbed wire. He'd spent hours cutting it free, ignoring the foal's panic, speaking in soothing tones. Once it was free, it limped away, and Daniel had thought that was the end of the story, but apparently not. A wave of emotion washed over him. He realized how many years he'd spent alone here since losing his family, how bitterness had seeped into his spirit. Yet this horse had not forgotten kindness. The storm had tested them both, forging a bond that defied logic. He gave the Mustang a final pat and said softly, "Guess we saved each other." He lingered in the barn, making sure the horse had enough hay and water, then turned his attention to the wreckage left by the storm. He ventured out to check on his cattle, heart sinking at the sight of frozen drifts where he knew some of them might be buried. The day stretched on, filled with grim discoveries, interspersed with small miracles. Some of the cattle had found shelter behind a rocky outcrop. Others were gone, lost to the storm or predators. Each carcass was a hard blow, reminding him how fragile life was out here. But each survivor renewed his sense of purpose. He was their caretaker, their guardian. He spent hours trudging through snow, guiding the living ones back to enclosures, giving them what meager feed he had left. The day after, the Mustang was still there, quietly waiting. Daniel realized he wanted this horse to stay, though it was not his to tame. The stallion had proven it possessed a spirit that wouldn't be broken. Yet, to his relief, it showed no sign of leaving. The horse seemed content to stand in the barn, wandering out into the yard occasionally, but always returning. Over time, Daniel dared to place a hand on its flank more confidently, brush its coat, speak in a low voice about chores and memories. And each day, as the Mustang healed from the wounds of the wolf attack, it would nicker softly whenever Daniel came around, a greeting that warmed the old farmer's heart more than the wood stove ever could. He noticed, too, that the stallion kept an eye on him, as though it understood his fragility. One morning, Daniel stumbled on a patch of ice, and the horse nickered sharply, stepping over as if to check on him. A laugh escaped Daniel's lips, something he hadn't done freely in a long while. He rested a hand against the horse's neck, murmuring his thanks. Every day brought new tasks and new struggles. The storm had destroyed large sections of fence, leaving him to patch them up in the freezing cold. He worked slowly, mindful of his age, but each time he glanced back toward the house, he'd catch a glimpse of the Mustang standing there, watching with those keen, dark eyes. He found himself talking to it at length, sharing old stories about his wife, about how he'd built this ranch from nothing. The horse, of course, never answered, but its quiet companionship was solace enough. The nightmares that had plagued Daniel after the storm began to recede. Each night he'd stoke the fire, feed Rusty, and prepare some food for himself. Often he'd leave the barn door ajar so the Mustang could come and go. Sometimes the horse would wander the property, stepping gingerly over the snowdrifts, but it always returned by nightfall, never straying too far. Daniel couldn't fully explain it, but he felt a sense of destiny in their shared survival, as though the cruelty of the storm had crafted a bond that transcended words. On the days when the bitter wind picked up again, he worried the horse might vanish into the plains, returning to the wild. But each morning it was there, greeting him with that low, comforting nicker. He supposed the Mustang had its reasons, something deeper than just gratitude. The scar told a story of trust, betrayal, and rescue, threads woven through both their lives. Maybe the horse recognized a kindred soul in an old man who refused to give up. Or maybe it was as simple as the fact that the horse wanted shelter, feed, and the quiet companionship of someone who meant no harm. Whatever the reason, it was enough. Daniel found himself smiling more, working with renewed vigor despite his aches and pains. The ranch, battered as it was, began to feel like home again. Each nail he pounded, each fence post he replaced, reminded him that giving up was never an option. The storms of life might be relentless, but as long as he drew breath, he would stand and fight. As the snows melted with the coming spring, Daniel realized he'd never thanked the horse properly. Not in a real sense, anyway. One morning, he stood in the barn, the stallion munching on oats from a bucket, and he spoke with a trembling voice. "I don't know if you can understand me," he said, "but thank you for saving my life out there. I figure I owe you everything." The horse lifted its head, ears rotating to catch his voice. Daniel reached out, gently running a hand along its neck. The Mustang leaned into the touch. Tears welled in Daniel's eyes, though he couldn't say why. Maybe it was relief, or the ghost of old grief stirring. Either way, he didn't try to stop them. He let a few tears fall into the horse's mane, soaking into the thick hair. The stallion breathed softly, exhaling warm air against Daniel's shoulder. It was in that moment that Daniel fully understood why the Mustang had stayed. It wasn't just about physical survival. Something deeper linked them, an understanding that they were both lonely souls. The horse had roamed wild and free, but it remembered kindness once given. And Daniel, after losing so much, had a glimmer of hope in caring for another living being. They had saved each other, not just from the storm, but from the numbing isolation that threatened to break them both. That day, as the first hints of green appeared under the thinning snow, Daniel decided the horse needed a name. "Ghost," he said aloud. It seemed fitting, since the horse had appeared out of nowhere, haunting the storm like an apparition. The Mustang seemed untroubled by the name, snorting only once as if to say, "Fine by me." Ghost it was. And from that day forward, the old farmer and the wild stallion lived side by side, forging a new story out of the ashes of the storm. Sometimes, Daniel would wake in the middle of the night, heart pounding from a half-remembered nightmare of wolves and swirling snow. He'd sit up, drenched in sweat, thinking he was back in the storm. Then he'd hear the soft nickering from the barn or the thump of hooves in the yard, and he'd remember that he was safe. Ghost was there. He'd pull on his coat and boots, wander outside, and stroke the horse's mane, reassured by its calm presence in the moonlight. In those quiet moments, with Rusty trotting by his side, Daniel felt the weight of loneliness lift. He wasn't alone anymore. In time, news of the old farmer and his wild stallion spread through the small town, carried by the few visitors or passing ranch hands who spotted the unusual pair. Folks would come by just to see if the rumors were true, that Daniel Hayes, the gruff and solitary rancher, had somehow befriended a Mustang that had once roamed free. Most days, Ghost kept his distance from strangers, disappearing into the fields when unfamiliar vehicles approached. But sometimes, curious and unafraid, he'd stand near Daniel, watching these visitors with the same calm gaze that had stared down a raging storm. Daniel would shrug off their amazement. He didn't need anyone else's validation. He knew the truth of what had happened out there on that frozen night, how they'd battled the worst of nature together. Spring turned to summer, and the ranch began to flourish again. Some of the fences remained damaged, but Daniel made do. He added a fresh coat of paint to the house, planting a small garden out back. Ghost would wander by, nibbling on the wild grass that sprouted near the fence. Sometimes he'd sneak into the garden, nipping at Daniel's plants, earning a playful scolding. At night, Daniel would sit on the porch, enjoying the cool breeze, and Ghost would graze not far away. The old collie, Rusty, would lie at Daniel's feet, dozing contentedly. The three of them, an unlikely family, drawn together by adversity and bound by a loyalty that defied explanation. It was a peace Daniel had not felt in years, ever since losing his wife and child. Now, he felt almost whole again. One evening, as dusk settled over the plains, Daniel found himself reflecting on that storm. He remembered how close he'd come to giving up, how the cold had seeped into his bones and threatened to steal his life. It humbled him to think that a horse, this very horse, had stood between him and certain death. He knew some folks might chalk it up to chance or luck, but in his heart, Daniel believed in a sort of divine mercy that night. He believed Ghost had remembered his face, his smell, the moment years ago when he'd freed a helpless foal from wire. And when Daniel needed it most, that horse had returned to repay the kindness. It was a circle, a reminder that every act of compassion could ripple through time in ways we couldn't predict. If this story has touched your spirit, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that hope can be found in the unlikeliest of places. We bring you powerful survival stories every day, so stay tuned for more tales that remind us just how strong the bond between living beings can be.